one of the aspects that we've all seen across fintech and financial services is there's a lot going on when it comes to digital assets, crypto, especially as of late, and how it relates to the political environment and regulation. So I was just talking with our two speakers, Ben Losky and Tom Brown, and I knew this, but they reminded me the BitLicense was 10 years ago. So a lot of what we're going to talk about is what happened, why, what's happened since, what's happening in the future. The Genius Act was recently passed. So on that note, please give it up for Ben Losky and Tom Brown.
None of you appreciate how special this is because I've known this guy for 35, 36 years, 37. Yeah. So we went to college together. Met. I was 17. I like to joke I was a teenage bride, but and I remember when Ben sort of parachuted into my life as he was appointed the superintendent of the New York Department of Financial Services. And I know that when you took that job, you did not expect that now, eight years after you left, that you would be known as the forefather of the BitLicense. And 10 years on from the BitLicense, with our first now real federal statutory framework for regulating crypto, I thought it would be interesting to look back at why we got the BitLicense, why we really waited a decade for any federal regulation, and where we think things go from here. And for me, the anchoring event, and looking around the folks listening to us, your entire sort of professional careers and much of your adult life has taken place in the shadow of an event that will be celebrating its 25th anniversary next year, and that explains, I think, in a lot of ways, the world that we have lived in from a financial regulatory perspective, and that's 9/11. And Ben's career oddly revolves around it. So, Ben, how did you get from working from Chuck Schumer in the late 1990s to running DFS in 2012?
Sure. So can you all hear me? Okay, good. It's so loud. I feel like I can't hear me. But maybe that's my old ears. So in around 1999, 2000, I was a young staffer, relatively young staffer with Chuck Schumer, and had decided that the only job I wanted to do was to be a terrorism prosecutor. And that was, this was back at a time, you're all too young, but where the Southern District of New York was bringing all the interesting terrorism cases. And so I applied to work with then Mary Jo White, who was the U.S. Attorney, later of SEC fame, and got the job. And between the time that I got the job and showed up at the job, 9/11 happened. And so I get sworn in November of 2001, 6 weeks or so after 9/11. And I think this is, a very serious time. And I'm very interested at that time in getting on the terrorism team at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And almost immediately, within a month or two of my getting there, all the terrorism cases went away. They all got moved out of the court system into Guantanamo Bay. Everyone went down to Gitmo, and those cases all became extrajudicial, many of them still pending 25 years later today. And so then I ended up being a prosecutor doing other things, first sort of narcotics cases, and then organized crime cases, throw in a biker gang here or there, and then ultimately I was a white-collar prosecutor. So I had a anti-terrorism mindset from the start, but I ended up in the world of sort of banking and white-collar investigations. And that eventually led me to another senior job during the financial crisis at the New York Attorney General's office, and then ultimately to running the Department of Financial Services.
And so one of the other sort of pivot points around 9/11, and most of you won't know this story either. Simon didn't even know it, and Simon knows everything. In 1998, the Treasury Department proposed a set of regulations that would require, and can you believe this? Every bank to run customers through a customer identification program. That seems like incredibly shocking, right? 250,000 people filed comments. Ron Paul, father to the senator from Kentucky, organized a campaign from the the floor of the House of Representatives to oppose this affront to our liberties. As the Twin Towers were smoldering, the Patriot Act passes, and that becomes enshrined in federal law. And we've now lived in a world for the last 25 years in which our financial system has been directed at combating state-sponsored terrorism. And when you joined DFS, some of your first and most public acts related to sort of picking up that thread.
Yeah, I mean, long before we got to the BitLicense, I'd say in 2012 and 2013, we worked on a series of matters that had been actually started before I ever got to DFS, where there were investigations of a bunch of international banks who had allegedly violated various sanctions rules. And it was interesting because when I looked at it closely, some of these cases were quite egregious. And the bank regulators were looking at it from a bank regulatory standpoint, which is, let's settle these matters, let's get these banks doing the right thing going forward, let's not disrupt the banking system. And I'm showing up with a kind of anti-money laundering, former prosecutor, think about what this could mean for the proliferation of terrorist financing. I'm showing up with that attitude. And I remember, getting the initial bank group showed up and said, we want to settle this case with a large British bank, hundreds of millions of dollars in sanctions violations, clear evidence of intentionality. They actually had guidebooks for their staff as to how to avoid getting detected when they were doing this. And I said, okay, what's the settlement? They said, well, it's a lot. We're going to do the settlement with, but we're going to do the settlement with a bunch of other federal regulators. So we'll all go as one, and the total settlement will be about $10 million. And I looked at them like they'd lost their minds. And we had one of those moments where we were just speaking different languages. But that ended up being a moment in time where I think DFS kind of defined itself as being willing to a little bit go the other way from how the system had been dealt with before. We ended up settling that case. It was a lot at the time. It seems like nothing today, but I think it was around $350 million. And then we did a series of additional similar types of cases, culminating in a settlement with BNPP about a year or two later, which was in the many billions of dollars range.
And so in the midst of this run of cases, right, and all of this history is now just sort of like, we don't think about it anymore. It's just the world that we live in, right? Like, banks are not supposed to support state-sponsored terrorism. They're not supposed to give their tellers guidebooks about how they can avoid the US sanctions regime. This is just not a thing that you do. In the midst of this run of cases, in 2013, an economist comes into your office and says, we have to talk about Bitcoin. Why?
Yeah, it's interesting. She was very excited about Bitcoin. I didn't know what she was talking about. She was a very smart chief economist at DFS, and she was tracking at the time what was going on in the banking system, believe it or not, in Cyprus. And they were having a banking crisis, and the Cypriots were pulling money en masse out of their banks and buying Bitcoin. And so I was confused why we were talking about this in the New York bank regulator's office, but she was adamant that we should think strongly about this because we had a number of companies starting to develop in New York, which is unsurprising as New York's a center for financial innovation. And she said, we should think about how we as regulators think about Bitcoin. At the time, it was mostly just Bitcoin. And so I said, okay, write a memo. And she wrote a memo, and we had another meeting. And I'll never forget, it was a really humbling moment for me because I said to her, look, what you've written is super interesting. Bitcoin sounds incredibly cool, but I don't understand why this matters that much because I have a fully digital experience today. I leave my little apartment, I go down to my little grocery store, I have my full shopping experience, I don't carry any cash ever, and I don't need Bitcoin, I have my credit card, what's the big deal? And I think anyone who's into crypto has had kind of a moment where it's like the light bulb goes off. Because she said to me, well, sir, in countries that don't have a modern banking system, or in countries that don't have a non-corrupt banking system, Bitcoin is incredible and potentially revolutionary. And then I have one of my most embarrassing moments. I said to her, yeah, and I'm a banking regulator, remember? I say, how many countries in the world don't have a modern banking system or don't have a non-corrupt banking system? And she's like, about 70% of the world's countries would qualify. And that was, for me, the light bulb moment. Okay, we should probably start to do some work around this and think about this. And we ultimately ended up deciding we wanted to learn more. It's hard to take you back to then, but it's sometime in late or mid 2013. We really didn't know anything. And so we decided, I had, again, worked in the Senate with Schumer, so I had in the back of my mind, one good way to learn about something fast is to hold hearings. You bring a bunch of experts in. It forces your staff to spend a lot of time getting ready for those hearings. And that was sort of the next big move in the early 2014.
Right. So January 2014, NYDFS schedules hearings around what ultimately becomes the BIT license. The panels, you can go back and watch. All those hearings are on YouTube. I watched them. I watched some of them live because people were paying me to do it back then. And the first day, the day before, oh no, it was that morning.
That morning, yeah.
Right, that morning, Southern District of New York indicts and arrests Charlie Shrem and Robert Failla, who were both big players in the Bitcoin community for their connection to Silk Road. And the panel that's supposed to appear is Fred Ursum from Coinbase, Jeremy Liu from Lightspeed, the Winklevi.
Both of them.
Both. Was that coordinated? Because they look like ghosts. If you go back and watch the hearing, they look completely ashen.
Yeah, it's interesting. Everyone thought, I knew Preet. He was the U.S. Attorney at the time, Preet Bharara. We had worked together in the U.S. Attorney's office for many years. We were good friends, still are today. And there was a lot of talk that we had somehow coordinated this, which was completely untrue. You never, as a prosecutor, tell anyone outside the prosecutor's office when you're going to make an arrest. It's actually illegal to do that, usually. And so we had no idea. I found out about those arrests when I saw them online 2 hours before the hearings were supposed to start. FBI usually arrests people very early in the morning. And so I think they arrested them 6 a.m. It probably became public around 8 a.m. I think our hearings were scheduled for 10 a.m. So I had no idea. Preet certainly knew that that was the morning of our hearings because I had invited him to testify. We had a law enforcement panel later in the day. He had sent his top deputy, a guy named Rich Zabel. But yeah, there was no coordination. It certainly made the day very interesting. And I think if you read some of the histories that are out there, the Winklevi are in the cab on the way down to the hearing, and they're calling their lawyers saying, because they've done a lot of work with Shrem, saying, do we still go to this hearing? They showed up, and yeah, people were a little bit nervous.
They were definitely on the back foot. So If you look back at those hearings now and the witness list 10 years later, who got it? Who got it right? What do you wish you had done differently?
Yeah, I mean, those hearings were, we learned a ton. I mean, it was, I know we're NerdCon, like, I thought of those hearings as a nerd fest. It's an environment I'm very comfortable in. I wanted to just learn, and have the staff really learn. And we tried to choose different panels of both investors and early adopters and marketplaces and professors, prosecutors. We wanted to get sort of a 360 view of everything we could learn about Bitcoin and crypto at the time. You know, looking back on it, I think some of the testimony was a little overblown. Some of the investors were, I remember, I think it was Jeremy at one point said, you know, there's this thing called programmable money, and someday we're going to solve cancer. We're going to, you know, cure cancer on a blockchain. And it was a little out there. But the only other thing I would have done differently, I think, is had more former regulators come testify, or former policymakers, about other kind of analogous situations where you're trying to regulate in an environment where it's a new technology that's constantly changing. Because that was one of the real challenges, is how do you regulate when the technologists are constantly innovating, constantly changing? We wrestled with it for a long time after, and I think we're still wrestling with it today. So that was a big change.
Yeah, so you fast forward through the hearings. At the time, the Bitcoin market cap was 3.2 billion, right?
Around there, I think a year later, when we passed the Bitcoin regulation, year and a half later, it's probably trading around 250, 230, and a market cap around 3 billion.
So Ben wasn't allowed to buy then because he was a regulator, but he's made up for it since. 3 weeks after the hearings, Mt. Gox collapses, 850,000 Bitcoin lost. I think you're in Switzerland.
Yes, I'm at a conference in Basel, believe it or not, with a bunch of other international regulators from all over the world. And I was the designee for the US for reasons I won't bore you with. And my beeper starts going crazy. I step out, I call the office. Mt. Gox has collapsed. What do we do? What do we do? We're talking about it. And I have this moment where I say, you know, this is going to be this incredible moment of international comedy. And I was always looking to do stuff that I shouldn't do. So I said, I'm in a meeting right now. Right across from me are the Japanese regulators. This is where Mt. Gox was. I said, I'm going to go back in the meeting. I'll say to the Japanese regulators, we have a team. They've been studying Bitcoin. We had these hearings. And we'll put them on a plane to Japan, and they will help you, Japanese regulators, sort this out. So I say this to the Japanese regulators, thinking this is going to be like this great moment of stupid New York regulator is now on the international stage. And the Japanese regulators looked at me like I was nuts. They didn't know what Mt. Gox was. They weren't thinking about regulating crypto at all. Just was not on their map whatsoever. So my attempt at international comedy failed miserably. I embarrassed myself in front of a bunch of international regulators, but the attempt was valiant.
So that accelerates the development of the BitLicense.
A lot. I mean, I'd say we have the hearings in January. That's in February. I had thought we would go slow. We would do the reg over time. It would take, could take up to 2 years till you have a final reg. That happened, and we decided to not only move more quickly, but devote a lot more resources to it. Because when you start to see these hacks at the time, 800 million or whatever it was being lost was a lot of money, and we didn't want to see that happening in the U.S. So we sort of devoted many more resources to the effort, and we tried to speed things up. And even then, it took a while. I mean, we put out a first draft, I think, in the summer of 14, and then we ran a double regulatory process. We actually reissued the draft in February of 2015, and did a whole nother administrative process just because we thought this was important enough, and frankly, it was just hard. So we didn't want to make too many big mistakes.
So you issue your regs, and then nothing happens at the federal level. Like, when did you realize that nothing was going to happen?
That took a long time. I mean, we issued the regs in June of 2015. I thought we would see federal action. I thought it was obvious what we had done. I didn't think this was that complicated. It took a lot of time to figure it out, but we had done so much of the work. Feds have so many more resources. I thought we were going to see federal regulation in late 2016. Then I thought that in 2017. Then I predicted it for 2018 and 2019. And then in 2019, I got out of the predictions business. And here we are in 2024, we're finally seeing it.
Right, so 2024, we now have Genius. We still don't have market structure or regulation at the federal level. And the world has dramatically shifted, right? We spent 10 years debating something that didn't really come up at all in your hearings. Are crypto assets securities? Should we treat them as securities? Should we force them into that regulatory framework? Now it seems like the answer to that question, at least under this administration, is mostly no. So that's one development. A second development is if you go back in time to 2013, you reminded me of this. Ethereum didn't exist. The second largest crypto app by volume was Litecoin. That has not fared well in the intervening years. And yet today, one of the debates that raged at the time does seem in some ways to have come back. And at least judging from some of the activity here and some of what you're seeing around the world, I think anyone remember the Bitcoin versus blockchain debate? I mean, Bitcoin as an asset has clearly done well, but if you're looking at activity in terms of developers and commercialization, like digital money in the form of stable coins appears to have won. And so where do we go? Like, what is the future to which we're racing? Is it everything moves on chain? Is it sort of digital assets exist as a space of their own? And does one of those need a regulatory push? Any lessons to extract from your time at DFS and what you did with the BitLicense?
Yeah, I guess I would observe a couple things. One is, I think crypto would have been a lot easier to regulate. It was a lot easier to regulate when we regulated. So in late 2015, when our regs come out, like you said, Ethereum doesn't exist. The industry is just much smaller and much more manageable. DeFi obviously didn't exist. And so, I think in those years, kind of Trump administration number one, 2016 to 2020, was sort of the time that regulation could have happened, that it didn't happen. And everyone focuses on how the Biden administration, 2020 to 2024, didn't give clarity to the industry. Well, it was getting increasingly hard to do that. Not that they shouldn't have, they should have clearly, but there was a big miss in those early years, 2017, 2018, would have been like a perfect time to regulate. Where are we now? I think the Genius Act is a big step. It really is. And it is I think a pretty good piece of legislation. There's a lot of administrative implementation that has to happen now, Treasury, OCC, et cetera, and that's taking place over the course of the next year, and we'll see how that turns out. They're certainly taking lots of comments. We're obviously in sort of a regulatory off era now in the Trump administration, which I think is, some people see as positive. If it goes too far, you're going to potentially have a rubber band effect and a swing back. And I think if I'm running a company today, you've got to navigate this sort of high wire act of you want to try and assume that the regs are going to be there someday that need to be there. But at the same time, if all your competitors are assuming we're in a regulatory off environment, well, you want to sleep well at night by having the kind of regs, having the kind of protections in place at your company. You also want to wake up in the morning alive as someone running a company. And so navigating those two shoals, I think, is the trick.
Well, and one through line that you reminded me of as we were talking about this is beginning with 9/11, really through the BIT license, we had adopted a regulatory framework related to money laundering that required end-to-end visibility for every transaction. The BIT license actually created some flexibility because technologists were concerned that although you could KYC the person to whom you sold Bitcoin, you didn't necessarily have visibility to the other side of that transaction.
Yeah, that's right. So we, again, I think for what regulators should be doing in all these cases is whatever you're dealing with, you analogize it to the non-virtual, non-crypto world, and you ask yourself, what are the values that we're trying to enhance as regulators, and how do we normally do that? And then do they port over completely into the crypto world? Because as a regulator, you should sort of treat like things alike whenever you can, but if you can't, you can't. And it was one of the lessons, one of the hard lessons of the BIT license was, as we looked, for example, at our AML rules, which we wanted to port over, we realized going from either draft 1 to draft 2 or draft 2 to draft 3, that requiring kind of full KYC on where the crypto was going was often going to be very impracticable. And so we put in a provision that said you have to do that if it's practicable. And look, there we knew, hopefully, that everyone coming into the system was going to be KYC'd one way or another by someone. And that gets more complicated, I think, in a world of stablecoins where there's so much transferability and at such scale.
Right, and we're now accepting, at least in the Genius Act, the possibility that although the endpoints are KYC'd, the intermediate transaction activity is not necessarily visible to the stablecoin sponsor. And that represents a real pullback from the sort of maximalist AML regime that existed at 9/11. Now, like Ben, I think in some ways it's easier to build and operate a business in an environment where everybody understands exactly what they need to do. It's a little more complicated now because I do believe that to the extent that systems are used and hijacked by people who intend to do wrong, look, the feds are going to show up with machine guns at your door the next morning. And that makes things difficult for operators. But we promised to leave a couple of minutes for questions. So if we have any, anyone have a question?
Coming, I promise.
Do you think that we're going to have a central bank issued digital currency stablecoin? I'll repeat the question. Is Genius Act a precursor to a central bank issued stablecoin?
No, I can take this one. The Genius Act forbids the Fed from issuing a central bank digital currency and leaves it to private actors, which I think, super interesting and one of the major industry gets associated with that regulatory framework.
If you had the pen on the Clarity Act, oh, sorry, can you hear me? If you had the pen on the Clarity Act that is in Congress or being written right now, what would be the key provisions you would include inside?
Oh.
Please.
I mean, the key thing with respect to the Clarity Act is creating a taxonomy with regard to the kinds of digital assets. So we know that stablecoins and deposit tokens, not securities, with respect to other tokens, are they securities? Are they utility tokens? Are they derivatives? And what kinds of restrictions then exist with respect to their distribution? That's really what that is designed to do.
And look, that's what the EU has done. They've got this token taxonomy, and I think that would be in any final legislation. I think there'll also be a big anti-money laundering component.
Right.
We'll see. I mean, it's a big question, but I think there's a fair amount of action in Congress right now to make sure that there is, just like we did in the BitLicense, the obvious anti-money laundering rules that you would expect as the industry has just grown. So there are a bunch of other provisions. I mean, the Market Clarity Act, if it gets passed, and it won't happen in 25, but it very well could happen in 26, will be a very big deal for the industry because it does many, many things that the industry has been waiting for, including stuff around DeFi.
All right, one over here, right?
The DeFi world, I would say, easily the most interesting and challenging from a regulatory standpoint today, both at the federal level and the state level. So anyway, thanks. One more?
Yeah, I saw your presentation, the Consumer Bankers Association with Kevin back in July. It was very good. Everyone I talked to about it, I said it's kind of like a stablecoin 101 for the community bankers scene. I think it was really good. I think people got a lot out of it. But what's 1.2? What's maybe 2.0 for the community bankers or any other bankers we've got in the audience?
Well, I wrote a little piece yesterday for the Open Banker on deposit tokens. I certainly think Genius, both by what it does explicitly and then what it does implicitly in allowing for banks to create digital representations of deposits on public and private chains, represents a pretty fundamental shift in the banking industry. And I would love to see every financial institution begin experimenting with the use of digital assets. What I've suggested to folks, I'll say it again here, pick a vendor to pay with a digital asset. If you want to pay a law firm, I can promise you they're going to figure out how to get the money. But just begin getting people within your institutions comfortable managing the risks, the operational risks associated with these assets. I think that's an absolute imperative. Awesome, man.
Thank you.